Welcome to this first lecture of scientific and statistical reasoning. I already hinted last week in the general introduction. If you missed that, there's a video on Canvas. Make sure you view it. On what we're going to do, I already hinted on what we're going to do this semester. And for this first lecture, I still want to talk to you about, well, two things, basically. So in the second part of the lecture, we're going to get started with identifying arguments. So we're going to get busy with doing the first steps, taking the first steps of recognizing arguments as well as recognizing parts of arguments. So what are the premises, what are the conclusions? And we're going to try and differentiate and practice differentiating between arguments and other stuff, non-arguments, stuff that we can't analyze that way. Before we get going, though, I want to introduce the course itself to you. Basically, what I want to convince you of is that, well, I want to make it clear to you what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, why that's relevant, and how we're going to do it for this semester. So I'm first going to give you some indication of why it's relevant to learn the skills you're going to learn in this specific course. And then we're going to talk about what the course will look like, and there will be some opportunities to ask questions about the course requirements, etc., if there are any. All right, so let's get started. Two parts: course introduction and the first step of argument analysis, which is learning how to identify arguments. At the end of this month, you should be more fluent in analyzing arguments. That would mean that you're more fluent in taking these 5 steps. If I ask you to assess argumentation, then I'm basically asking you to take these 5 steps. The first one is a permanent step, you might say. You have to be open to developing a critical disposition. You have to scrutinize everything around you and be on the lookout whether a situation calls for a more critical analysis, which is what we call developing a critical disposition. If you have the critical disposition, sometimes you signal a situation in which it is called for to assess an argument. The first step, of course, then is, or the second step in this overview, is learning to recognize the elements of arguments, recognize whether something is an argument and what it consists of. You need to learn to reconstruct those arguments. So if you've distilled all the different components from the written or spoken argument, you need to be able to reconstruct that in a form which shows the intended structure of the argument. And then we can get going with the actual assessment. First of all, we're going to look at logical assessment, so at the structure of the argument, and then at factual assessment, which is a long list. I perhaps lost you somewhere at number 2 or 3, I guess, but I'm just going to show you, hey, this is the list we're going down this month, and we're starting at step number 1, which is also an important reason for taking this course, important reason for us to set up this course in the way it's set up, because we want to stimulate you to develop a critical disposition, and I'm going to show you why that is relevant. So basically what you can say in one sentence, our goal these 3 months of this course is to train you to think critically about scientific psychological research. That's basically it, right? That seems doable. And I'm now going to break down this statement for you, what we mean by this and why those elements are relevant. First of all, we want to train you to think critically. Why is that the case? And you could perhaps think of your own examples, and I gave you one example last week in the introduction. But I'm going to give you some other reasons, some other triggers perhaps for you to think, well, yeah, it's indeed important to learn to think critically, to develop that critical disposition. So perhaps one of the panelists that are still there, all 16 of you, I have a question for one of you. So if you have an idea, unmute yourself and answer it. So there was 8 years ago or so, I think 2012, there was a survey done in the United States, And they asked participants in the survey, do you think the sun revolves around the Earth or the other way around? How many people do you think, what percentage of people thought it was the other way around? If any one of the panelists would like to answer, please do so. Unmute yourself and throw out a number, a percentage. You think, a percentage of Americans that think that the sun revolves around the Earth. Anyone? Krisha, go ahead. What? 90%?
80% the sun revolves around the Earth. Yeah.
80%?
Yeah.
All right. So, but what I'm basically asking is, what percentage of people do you think got this question wrong? Still think 80%.
I think it was about 20% got it wrong.
Wow. Yeah, I think you're about right.
I read the literature.
You read the literature. Okay, that's excellent, and a good example. Yeah, you should indeed study the literature. Thanks for that. It's about 20.
The answers in the chat varied from 80 to 20% or something.
Oh, okay. So the amount of participants that got it wrong was, I believe, 27%. Oh, now I don't know the exact percentage. 26%. Yeah, I need to look that up. In the same survey, 39% answered correctly that the universe began with the huge explosion, and only 48% said human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. So it's a survey. Of course, you need to look critically at the survey itself as well. But you might say that facts, as we consider them to be, are not well known by everyone, right? So it's not the case that, in general, people are very cognizant about what is true and what is not, which is one of the reasons why you should be always on the lookout and have that critical disposition and should always be open to learn more stuff. I'm going to give you another example. Somewhat more recent than that survey. This is Donald Trump, I think, just before or right after he became president, tweeting about the link between vaccines and autism. So, a healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shot of many vaccines, doesn't feel good and changes. Autism, all caps. Many such cases. It's implicit here, but what he's trying to imply is that, well, getting vaccinated will get you autism. And that's a general belief as well. A lot of people believe that that is indeed the case, even though there's no research showing that it is the case. Another reason why we should be on the lookout, right? I'm just trying to trigger your critical disposition. Another reason why we need to be critical thinkers, and being critical thinkers, by the way, doesn't mean that we need to be disbelieving about everything everyone is ever saying. No, critical thinkers are interested in the reasons why people believe what they believe, right? So if somebody's saying you such and such is the case, Donald Trump is saying vaccines cause autism, you're not saying you're an idiot, but you're saying, well, perhaps you're an idiot, but I'm interested in why you think that is the case. Give me good reasons for believing why vaccines cause autism, right? And that's necessary because we also live in an age of perhaps that's a permanent age, and that has always been the case, but it is the case now, an age of incivility and polarization. So in this example, this is a letter written by Yancey in an editorial in the New York Times, or a column in the New York Times, and in which he addressed his public, the American public, saying, Dear white America, I have a weighty request. As you read this letter, I want you to listen with love, a sort of love that demands that you look at parts of yourself that might cause pain and terror. As James Baldwin would say, did you hear that? You might have missed it. I repeat, I want you to listen with love. Well, at least try. So from the outset, before anything else was coming in this column, he asked his audience to be open-minded, to bear love in their hearts and to consider what the author was saying. Did they really? Well, there was a lot of backlash to this column in which he claimed that most people, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't want to end up in a polarized debate about the interpretation of the column, but most people are racist in some form, right? So in your thinking, in your actions, even if you don't intend to be racist, most people still are, according to Yancey. For sure, that's a controversial message. That's hard to hear for a lot of people. But he was very friendly about it, right? He asked them kindly to please consider what he was saying with openness and love in their hearts. A lot of people didn't, right? So there was a lot of backlash, very hateful messages towards the author, even death threats. So that shows you, and it might not be a surprise to you, that we're living in a very polarized age. A lot of people are not very willing to consider the other people's point of view, particularly if that person is from another social group than you consider yourself to be. Which makes a lot of things messier, right? So if even following well-intended instructions on keeping yourself healthy becomes part of a political debate, like wearing face masks has become, then it's difficult to get to the truth. It's difficult to have a useful conversation or useful debate about what we consider to be true or useful or worthwhile. Because everything, even wearing a face mask during a pandemic, becomes polarized. Am I listening to you? Do you even consider it relevant to wear a face mask? It doesn't really matter. It just depends on your political orientation, right? So in this age of incivility and polarization, it's all the more relevant to train people to consider the reasons other people have for drawing certain conclusions, to have other people developing a critical disposition. Another reason why we live in a polarized age, and that's the final example or argument I want to give you why you should develop that critical disposition, that technology makes it easier to be, or it seems that technology makes it easier to become polarized yourself, right? So people have all these, let's say, polarizing cognitions built in, right? So we have confirmation bias. We search for confirmation of our ideas. We seek out people who are similar to us in their thoughts and their actions. But we also use technology that works on algorithms that is that makes it more likely that we're presented with stuff that we were presented with in the past, or that we liked in the past, stuff that is more in line with what we thought before, then that differentiates from what we thought before. It creates filter bubbles and echo chambers, as they're called. So 3 reasons. So we're living in an age of incivility. We're living in an age of polarization. People are less likely to consider what other people are saying just because they're from a different group. And we're living in an age in which technology potentially enhances the fact that we're unlikely to focus on disconfirming evidence or thoughts that deviate from, or information that deviates from our current point of view. So we're living in an age that calls for, as Chomsky calls it, a course in intellectual self-defense, right? Citizens of the democratic society should undertake a course of intellectual self-defense to protect themselves from manipulation and control and to lay the basis for meaningful democracy. So for all the reasons I just mentioned, as Chomsky says, it's essential for you to become skilled in intellectual self-defense, which we might paraphrase as, well, that course in intellectual self-defense, or part of that course in intellectual self-defense is the course you're taking now, in which we're going to focus on critical thinking. We're going to focus on analyzing arguments. Of course, we're going to, in the 2nd and the 3rd month, focus on applying that to scientific thinking, right? So how do we use those skills to analyze arguments in scientific publications, and how do we use those skills to become better thinkers about psychological constructs, the stuff we're interested in, right? The psychological theories we try to test. But in this 1st month, we're going to focus on general examples as well, the general skills. All right, so that's why we want to train you to think critically. What that means, thinking critically, is a bit vague often. So that's why I had you read the separate chapter for today. because most definitions about critical thinking are a bit broad. But I'm going to try to give you a more intuitive idea by giving you a couple of examples. I'm not sure whether those were in the reading as well. I'm a bit in doubt right now, but let's just try it out. So, given us the following task. So the key to answering the question and why the question is hard. The question is hard because you need to realize what information you need to consider. There's a lot of it, and you think, well, I need to, for every interval, and you need to measure when the bird is where, when it turns the first time, and the second time, the third time. At least that was my thought process when I was a student and I was first posed this question. Of course, when you realize that trains are traveling towards each other at 25 miles an hour, over a distance of 50 miles, which means that they will have traveled, they will meet each other or collide in an hour. And if you know that the bird is flying 60 miles an hour, you know that the bird has flown 60 miles after an hour has passed. So that's it. So the question is more complicated, less complicated than it seems. What makes it complicated is that you have to figure out what the right steps are to get to the answer, which is one part of critical thinking. I'm going to illustrate another part of critical thinking. And it's another silly example. I had to get this picture from the internet because I exclusively own black socks. I'm a very boring person. But because I'm such a boring person and I have such a boring sock drawer, I'm never faced with the following conundrum, which is, let's say you have 2 different colors of socks and you have 18 blue socks and 36 green socks in the drawer, and it's dark and you have to draw out 2 socks, separate draws. And you're the kind of person who likes to wear socks in similar colors. So the question is, how many draws do you need? So how many times do you need to put your hand in the drawer and take out a sock in the dark before you know that you have a matching pair? Nestor wants a prize. Yeah, let me think about that. All right. 3 is an answer I see returning. And again, the point here is, very well, the point is that sometimes people start out making complicated calculations. What do I remember from random draws and all my thoughts about probability and what I know about it, all my knowledge about probability. But you don't really need it here, right? So if you just go through the motions, you think, well, drawing a first sock, which is either black or blue, green or blue. I'm drawing out another one, which is again either green or blue, and they either match or not. And then I draw, if I don't match, I do a third sock, and then I'm done, because for sure it will either match the second sock or the first sock in color. So you don't have to continue after that. Again, it seems like a complicated question. It's actually, if you figure out the right process, easier to do. And being able to reflect on that, what is actually asked of you, being able to switch between tool sets, as it were. Do I need my probability theory tool set here, or do I need something else? Do I need to do something else? That's essential in becoming a critical thinker. So the question is depicted below. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? Is that yes, no, or it cannot be determined? So we know John is looking at Bobby, Bobby is looking at Jimmy. We don't know whether Bobby is married or not. And the question is a married person looking at an unmarried person? All right. So, I don't know who said that, but... Krisha again. Hi. Why do you think C?
You don't know, like, it doesn't say anything about married or not, so...
Yeah. And that makes sense, right? That's what I initially thought as well, right? So it has to be, this is not useful, sorry. It has to be C because we don't know whether Bobby's married or not. So we cannot determine whether a married person is looking at an unmarried person because she's in the middle, right? Any other thoughts? I'm getting a lot of C's, but I'm also getting an A here. So you guys are thinking about it. So that's very good. I want you to really consider these examples, which is what you're doing. So, of course, you think C. I think that makes sense, and that's also what the people who constructed this question or this riddle. Some people are starting to say A now. like Gerenzo. Well done, because you can indeed conclude that the answer should be A. It should be yes. How? Well, what you have to do, and as part of that critical disposition that we talked about, being critical thinking or developing that critical disposition, is considering what tools do I need in this case. In this case, you have to consider all alternatives. So you don't know whether the person in the middle is married or not, but you do know that there are only two options, right? That person is either married or not married. Those are the only two possible scenarios. So if we look at those two possible scenarios depicted above, we're assuming that the person in the middle is married. Then we can say a married person is looking at an unmarried person. So then yes, the answer is yes. We don't know whether the first situation is the case or the second, but we know that in the first situation, the answer is yes. And if we look then at the only other possible scenario, scenario 2, in which the person is not married, then again, a married person is looking at an unmarried person. It's fun, right? I think it's fun. And what we learned here, or what the point is of this example, is that people sometimes forget that it's important when thinking carefully about stuff is to consider alternatives, right? So what are the odds of this happening given that that fact is true or not? Or in this case, what are the odds? What would the answer be in that case, and what would the answer be in the opposite case? And in this example, and that's why it's a fun example, it yields you the full and complete answer because there are just two possible scenarios. That's crucial, right? If we're assessing arguments, the most critical skill you can develop is thinking opposite, right? So considering the opposite of what someone is proposing. So that guy or girl is concluding such and such because that is the case. How likely would that be true if it were not the case, right? So we're weighing different alternatives and seeing how likely the conclusion or the information or the theory would be, which is also essential in statistical thinking, in considering your research hypothesis and your statistical hypothesis under a specific assumption. How likely are these results to happen? And under different assumptions, how likely are these results to happen? We'll get into that later. For now, it's important that you know that part of developing a critical disposition is what's being called disjunctive thinking. You don't have to remember the term, but it means that you consider alternative scenarios and look at the likelihood of different things happening under those different assumptions. All right, the reason why we need to learn this, as is described in the second chapter for today, I'm going to read the quote to you. If we cannot think intelligently about the myriad of issues that confront us, then we are in danger of having all the answers but not knowing what they mean. The twin abilities of knowing how to learn and knowing how to think clearly from the rapidly proliferating information that we must select from are the important intellectual skills for the 21st century. So having a critical disposition, thinking about for yourself about what information presented to you actually means, is essential because indeed using Google, for example, or any other forms of digital media, using Wikipedia, we have more options than ever to come to the answers that we seek. That doesn't mean that we are more skilled at asking the right questions and interpreting those answers. I wanted to illustrate to you how silly that can be. Perhaps you've tried it for yourself. I'm just going to show it to you here. So if you're trying to ask the ultimate question, so you want to know the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and you put that in Google, one of those technologies I mentioned, then you actually get an answer. The answer is 42. Exactly 42, no more, no less. They even included a nice calculator these days, I see. That point still is, you can find all the answers you like online. You still have to know what they mean and what the questions are before it will make sense to you, which is another reason for becoming a critical thinker. The 42 examples from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, by the way, which somebody at Google appreciated and put in there. So it's there. I think it works the other way around as well. If you Google 42, you get the ultimate answer to life, the universe, and everything. Anyway, by now it should be clear to you why it's necessary to develop that critical disposition. And you've seen elements of what is contained in that skill set that we consider to be critical thinking. And I'm putting it that vaguely because there's not a very specific definition. There are multiple definitions of what critical thinking actually is. There's even a consensus statement. So a lot of people got together in 1990 and they didn't really draw up a definition that would be too ambitious. They said, well, this is the stuff we agree on, right? There's consensus on this, and we all agree that these elements should be contained in what we call critical thinking. I've summarized that for you a little bit. So what it says actually is that what we call critical thinking is partly developing that attitude, that disposition we talked about. It's partly having current knowledge, the right knowledge, and the right thinking skills to act on that knowledge or to think about that knowledge. And I don't expect you to know the full definition. I just wanted to stress that it contains different parts. It's not only having those skills and that knowledge, it's also having that disposition, the willingness to use the skills and the ability to recognize what skills are called for. There are somewhat more shorter definitions of critical thinking, and they indeed all include that disposition, right? Thinking that is purposeful, reasoned, and goal-directed. When a thinker is using skills that are thoughtful and effective for the particular task and type of thinking context and thinking task. And there are more general definitions which are very much in line with the stuff we're going to train you in this month about identifying assumptions and evaluating assumptions and being able to view one's own ideas in several perspectives. What if I'm right? What should I do? What if I'm wrong? What should I do? All right. So you need to learn critical thinking, and that what we mean by that is that at least that's the instruction to us instructors, is we should let you students instruct you explicitly in what we mean by that. So in this case, we're going to explicitly train you in skills of argumentation. And we want to instill that disposition for effortful thinking and learning, which is what I tried with the different examples that I gave in this first part of the lecture. And you need to study in ways that increase the probability of contextual transfer, which is a fancy way of saying that if you learn to apply the same skills in different contexts, you're more likely to use them in new contexts as well. So I'm not only giving you examples from research or from theory, but also from actual life, from the media, etc. And the reason for that is that I don't want you to just focus using those skills on, I'm putting my psychology study head on. No, you need to use those skills all the time. You can use them all the time. It's fun and useful to use them all the time. All right. The reason why that's fun and useful, mainly why it's useful, again, is, so I gave you a couple of reasons, right? The reasons are societal, right? The debates are polarized. People have false beliefs. A lot of people have false beliefs, which are obviously false. And the technological reasons we talked about. Another reason, the final reason, is that is relevant for you when you become a professional. Because it's difficult to say what you will be. So if you start your life as a professional, so perhaps you've already started, but most of you will start after finishing your degree. Then let's say you still have 60 years of work ahead of you, right? So perhaps that's too much, but let's say it's 50 or 60 years. It's difficult for me or for Sharon to predict what you need, what type of skills you need now, then in 50 years or so. But we can try to prepare you by becoming a critical thinker, so that you're able to develop those skills on your own, that you learn the disposition to always be on the lookout and checking what is needed and what set of skills is called for in what situation, so you can make those skills your own, even if the required skills change along the way. All right. For example, and this is not so silly an example, right? So let's say you're working as a therapist in an institution, right? You've completed your degree. You started working with children because you thought it was awesome. You did developmental psychology, clinical developmental psychology, and ended up working in an institution somewhere that works with children that have autism. One day your boss calls you and says, well, we're going to do the whole thing differently. I just read a couple of papers and I read about this awesome thing, sees autism. And I now know what causes autism, and we need to do an overhaul, right? All those therapies you're proposing, they don't work. It's we actually need to apply SEES therapy, which is more focused on the actual causes of autism. Everyone knows that 70% of autism cases are due to vaccines, 25% to toxic medication and other substances, and 5% to some diseases. And this therapy, isotherapy, focuses on that. It's a form of homeopathy, which is, I'm not going to go into that, but it's silly. So it's a silly thought. I think it's a silly thought. You should think it's a silly thought. But it could happen to you, right? There are people believing this, and it could be your boss that actually believes something silly, and you need to be on the lookout. This is a new thing. This is what people are believing. Is it actually true? I didn't hear about it during my studies, that those assumptions underlying that form of therapy are nonsensical. So you have to figure it out on your own. That's why we're teaching you those skills. And that's why we have to stress that we cannot teach you everything that's potentially true or untrue and necessary to know in the future. But it is critical that you learn those critical thinking skills. All right, so becoming a scientific and statistical reasoner obviously involves critical thinking, and it involves more than just memorizing a collection of facts, right? So a lot of your first year psychology, perhaps you viewed it as memorizing a lot of facts. You need to do more. You need to be able to do more than that. You need to be able to build on that with a different set of skills. You need to be able to generate your own hypotheses and test them and review your theories along the way. You need to be educated in a way that knowledge is created, and different ways in which knowledge can be created, and what your role in that process can be. That's relevant if you're going to become a researcher, but also if you become a therapist or an applied psychologist. All right, so one final example. I'm sorry for all the examples. I like them, but perhaps you're getting the sense that it goes quickly. But the idea is you don't need to know every separate example. I just want to instill the importance in you that you apply these skills not only when here in this lecture or when you're doing an exam, but try it out sometimes I'm sorry for that, when you check online for news, for example. All right, so final example, if you go to the website Want to Know, because it's for those who want to know, you can learn some stuff about vaccines, right? And one of the things that's published there is the following. So they show this graph, these research results, and it says, because the number of children who had not been vaccinated was officially too small, a correct statistical evaluation is almost impossible. But that does not mean that the study was worthless. This study did in fact show that unvaccinated human children in the 2 or 3 examined age categories had fewer infections and atopic abnormalities than the children who had been vaccinated. So, what is striking to you? And what I'm trying to illustrate is how your, in this case, statistical reasoning skills are relevant outside of SPSS as well. So what strikes you in this comparison? So what they're basically saying is, yeah, sure, some statistics were not in order in this research, but look at the means. They differ, right? There's a difference between one group and the other. What is striking between the one group and the other, and what do we need to take into account when comparing these two groups?
Confidence interval.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
The confidence interval.
Yeah, what about the confidence intervals?
They're huge and they fall within each other.
Yeah. What does that mean? They're huge and they overlap, right? Or the one follows the other. It might be a more correct interpretation. What does it mean for the comparison between the means? let's just say and put it informally, right? So you're going to talk with Sharon on Thursday about what the correct way of talking about these confidence intervals is, and what would be the case when they're overlapping or more than just partially overlapping. What it informs of us is what you can look at here in the bottom of the screen. So the unvaccinated group is very, very small. So that's what they tried to say or account for in the beginning of the quote. It was officially too small, but here's the difference between the means. What you should think as a critical scientific reasoner is that, yeah, because one group was that much smaller than the other, perhaps it's not very informative to compare those means. Because, of course, the confidence interval or the range of possible differences of possible means. Now, let's just put it in simple terms. So the uncertainty for one part of the sample is way bigger than for the other one, because one sample is bigger than the other. One part of the sample is bigger than the other, which is part of your statistical thinking toolkit, right? So that's the point for now. And you're going to talk about the nitty-gritty and confidence intervals and what happens with those estimates once sample size increase. Sharon has an excellent graphical illustration of that. So you're going to see that on Thursday. But for now, the point is you should see how your statistical reasoning skills are relevant outside of the context of this course. You should be able to know more about what's happening here, and you should be able to know how you can account for sample size in comparing different numbers. All right. So you should by now know what the goals of this course are, even though I didn't translate the acronym for SSR. I'm sorry, I will do that in the final slides. So the goals for this course are to teach you in critical thinking, to teach you scientific thinking about psychology. So apply those critical thinking skills about psychological science and the model way of doing research in psychological science. And to teach you statistical reasoning, which is more than just knowing what to click in SPSS, which is more than knowing just what to calculate when asked what specific question, but also to understand what an answer means and what calculations or type of considerations are called for depending on the type of problem you're presented with. And we're going to teach you a host of practical skills in the use of SPSS and the R software. So we want to train you to think critically about scientific psychological research. We talked about the first two parts. Briefly, I'm going to mention the latter part of the definition. So, of course, you need to become a critical thinker. Of course, we're going to train you to become one because it's relevant for that host of reasons I discussed. But it's also relevant to apply those skills in your thinking about psychology. The mindset I want you to develop is not to take things for granted. So if you read research about the effects of hazing or initiation in a studentenvereniging, the student society. So this is an example how they used to do it back in the day in Amsterdam, which is still corona-proof, right? You can just hose down people wearing underpants in a field somewhere, just throwing out ideas for people conducting hazing. The question might arise, right? So why are people submitting themselves to these type of treatments? Well, an answer might be cognitive dissonance reduction, right? So the more annoying the initiation or the hazing becomes, the more reason people have to align two thoughts they have with each other, right? I have one cognition, I really want to be part of this group. And I have the other one, how annoying is this? People are treating me badly. And there's dissonance between the cognitions. I want to be with this group, they're treating me badly. And you have to align those, which is the process of cognitive dissonance reduction, according to this group of psychologists. And how you can align them is either to make it even more attractive, so make the group even more attractive to be a part of, or you could just say, well, it's not that bad, right? I'm with my friends standing in the field in my underpants, so yeah, not that bad. It's raining as well, so it could be worse. Could be wearing clothes. Anyway, you're trying to align two different cognitions, and that would be cognitive dissonance reduction. So what you perhaps used to do back in the day when you were first-year students is think, well, okay, people did research on that, and they compared two groups, and the conclusion would be that cognitive dissonance reduction is in fact a process taking place. What I want you to be able to do after this course is think about what happens under the hood, right? So this would be the hood of the car, in a manner of saying, in which the authors draw a conclusion. Intense hazing will produce cognitive dissonance reduction, which increases liking for the group doing the hazing. And you, as a critical thinker, scientific reasoner, should be able to think, well, okay, why are you concluding that? That conclusion consists of two different parts. I see that there is an effect of hazing, and I see that that effect can be best explained by a certain theory. How are the authors going into those different parts? So why do they conclude that there even is a difference between hazing and non-hazing? Oh, they use an experiment, and they use not an actional initiation, but just a tape recording, or people had to record on tape. They had to read a list of naughty words that might be considered sensitive back in the 50s or the 60s, and that was the hazing procedure. Do you actually consider that support for the conclusion that there is an effect of hazing? On the other hand of the conclusion is the interpretation of that difference. There is an effect, and how can we best explain that effect? So even if there is an effect, how would you best be able to explain it? Well, cognitive dissonance reduction. Well, what are the assumptions of cognitive dissonance reduction? Well, there is a feeling of dissonance, feeling of arousal, and that arousal will decrease if people change their cognitions. Did they actually measure both the arousal and the change? No, they just measured their change in behavior. So you didn't measure the cognitive dissonance, you just measured the reduction, which could also be interpreted differently. Again, this is a lot of information, but I just want you to give you the breakdown. So after doing this course, I want you to be able to check under the hood. Somebody's saying to you, such and such is the case because I found this difference. And you should be able to know, they're saying actually two things. I found a difference, which is a relevant difference, which I can generalize to an actual situation in real life. And I can explain it in this way. So you're able to break down what other people are saying to you in component parts and check the different components, which is difficult. And that's why we're starting out smaller. We're starting not out with full publications, but we're starting out with easier examples of argumentation. But it's relevant to do this for psychological science, to be able to break it down and to be able to check people's assumptions and the component parts of their arguments. Because people make a lot of assumptions. It is essential that researchers make assumptions to come to their conclusions. Even in the case that you give people this exact same data set, as was done here. So I think our 29 research teams got the same data set. So the research was done. Here's the data set. Go process the data, do your analysis, and write down your conclusions. Their conclusions, the effect size they estimate, differ between research group. There are even differences that in whether they found statistically significant effects or not, which weren't based on the data. No, they were based on the way they went about analyzing the data. So that shows you why it's relevant to check people's assumptions. You cannot just take their word for it that such and such is the case, because they made assumptions, and you need to check whether you agree with those assumptions or not, whether those assumptions hold in this case, because the effect they show, the conclusions they draw, depends on the assumptions they make. All right. It's also useful to put that critical gaze that you have, those critical thoughts towards thinking about psychology, because you can make more sense about stuff people are saying about psychological processes, right? So what we're going to be focusing on in the third part of the course. If somebody says extroversion makes Facebook users act more extroverted online, people make a lot of assumptions that you might have taken for granted in the past. So people are actually saying something about a measure of individual differences as a cause of a specific behavior. So you need to be able to think about how individual differences are measured, how causality works, and how measurement works to say something about that it was actually the case that there was more such and such between those groups, and it was caused by this construct. So to make sense of what people are saying about psychology and to make sense of psychological research, you need to be able to use those critical thinking skills. You need to be able to break down into components what people are saying to you, even if it's in published research. One final reason, and we're going to the break, why you need to become a critical thinker about psychology is because what we consider to be proper scientific research changes all the time. So when I did my studies, the hotshots in psychology were, for example, John Bartsch, depicted here as he's thinking, I don't know, deep and conflicting thoughts. I don't know, it's a good picture. And John Bartsch is famous, for example, for the research purportedly showing that people walk more slowly towards the elevator after they've been primed with words related to the elderly. And I think you've talked about this research with Dylan in the first year. You know that it doesn't hold up in replications. So it could be the case that you're learning all types of stuff in the first year of psychology, and in 5 years or 10 years or so, somebody's saying to you, well, that actually doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way, but we didn't do the research right. And now we found out that we should do research a different way. It's more useful to teach you how to evaluate those facts and to consider to teach you how to consider the assumptions other people make than just teach you the stack of facts which we're building on, because those might change all the time. It could also be the case that stuff in society changes, right? So the research was right all along, but stuff works differently now. So we need to build on different assumptions and different research than we did 10 years ago. All those are reasons to be critical about psychological science as well. Which wraps up this somewhat lengthy introduction. I'm sorry for that. But I hope you liked the examples, and I hope the examples showed you why it's relevant to become a critical thinker, why it's relevant to be a critical thinker in your actual normal life, but also when you think about psychological research and when you reason about psychological concepts and constructs. Which is what we're going to do in 3 blocks. We're starting out with those fundamental skills in reasoning about in reasoning about statistics. In the second block, we're gonna mostly try out model research practices. Which way do people analyze their data usually? Which type of designs do they use? And what are the most common ways of analyzing data in those designs? And also some critical footnotes about reasoning errors people have in model research practices. And in the final block, we're gonna use those critical glasses to look at how people reason about psychological constructs. We do that in different forms. So we have lectures as provided to you right now. We have tutorials. This week they start on Thursday and Friday, as they do every week. And you need to do some work yourself outside of those tutorials and lectures, which is do some reading, make the weekly assignments, and do the preparatory assignments or PAs for the tutorial. Deadline for the PAs is on Wednesday night. I think 5 before midnight, I guess, is the deadline. And in the tutorials, we're going to try, because these are online times, we're going to try and make your experience as small scale as possible, right? So you're basically mostly working with breakout rooms. So you're going to be assigned to a breakout room, which has a couple of other students. And you're working as a team, as it were, for the rest of the course, I guess. At least for the rest of the course. I don't know whether it's for the rest of the semester. And you're going to work together on all those exercises to make it somewhat more of an accessible and social experience. All right. Let me see. Yeah, I also have some general tips for studying online, so just read them through. I'm not going to point out each and every one of them for you. It's useful to have a clear structure to your day, especially if you're doing everything from your own house, right? So it helps if you don't burden yourself with new questions, new challenges every day. Will I get up at 10? Will I attend a lecture? What will I do when it's 12 o'clock, right? So if you have a clear day and night structure, if you have a clear structure to your day, you don't have to ask yourself those questions, because you know I'm always going to attend the lecture, so you don't have to think about it anymore. And you can spend all that energy on actual critical thinking during the lecture or during the tutorial. check out the rest of the tips as well. Stay healthy, get some fresh air, reach out to other people if you feel your mental health is slipping, which are all useful tips and which you can find online as well while using this link. Your grade for the course consists for 90% of the average of your exam grades. So there's 3 interim exams. At the end of each month, there will be an exam. We take the average of that, and what we add to that 90%, is the grade for your pecha kucha, or your presentation. I hope you can still hear me. My neighbors just decided to do some drilling in the wall, which is actually kind of weird because I don't have neighbors on that side of the house, but I'm going to check during the break what is happening. So 90% exam grade, 10% pecha kucha or presentation, which you set up during the second block of this course. So you're going to present some stuff on the difference between good science and bad science together with a group of students, which will make up 10% of your grade. The exam at the end of each month will take place online, and they will be online proctored. So it will be monitored what you're doing on your computer. During the exam, as you can read on Canvas in all detail, you are allowed to use the book by Andy Field.